All right, we'll call this meeting to order. Councilmember Saper, good evening. Who am I calling on here? Nick, Kim, Nick, good evening.
Good evening, Mayor, members of the council. Tonight, we're going to talk about kick off the FY 2024 budget process with a discussion on long-range financial planning. This is a follow-up to a work session we had in November discussing a lot of our operating funds and part of a focus to look, do more forward-looking with our budget process. So looking out 5 to 10 years, what are our challenges, opportunities over the next several years as we prep for our 2024 budget process.
So Nick and I are going to kind of work back and forth. That way you guys don't have to listen to only one person talk about financing. So Nick kind of mentioned that this is kind of the official public kickoff for the budget calendar. Staff has been working on the upcoming proposed budget over the last month or so. We are going to be changing things up with our budget proposal, the ones that you will see moving forward. We're actually going to incorporate the presentation that you see tonight. So we'll be incorporating a 10-year fiscal outlook at our revenues. We'll also be doing a little bit of a different thing for this community. We're actually going to be putting together a 5-year personnel budget. And this will help, hopefully, everybody kind of understand as we are a growing community. I think you have seen Chief Hargis talk about increased calls for service. If you look at all of the new homes under construction, that will soon have a lot of new North Kansas City residents in it. We are anticipating more growth for services, calls for services, and with that will come increased staffing to be able to properly accommodate those calls for service. So we will be putting together kind of what we think from a personnel standpoint our needs will be 5 years out for your consideration as part of the budgeting process. Another thing is eventually we're unsure if we're going to get to it this year, but our goal would be to do a 10-year capital outlook. What would be those projects from a long-term investment into our infrastructure? What would those investments look like, and when should the city kind of consider making those investments? A lot of that has to do with the timing of the 3 master plans that are currently either in development or will soon be in development. That is the stormwater, sewer, and water master planning. Once we receive all of those plans, we do plan to put them into a 10-year capital outlook. This way, we kind of know what the future assignments will be 10 years out, as well as if our revenues are matching that. So we feel like this will kind of help the governing body as well as the community think longer term when it's going through its capital investment needs. And really the goal would be to leave this community in a better position for the next generation. So Nick is going to kind of walk through some individual fund forecasts. We'll talk about some challenges, opportunities, and future considerations, and then look for some guidance on policy and budgeting.
So first up, I want to walk through some of the key dates that we have for the budget calendar this year. Right now, departments are working on their capital and operating requests, as well as Kim mentioned, for the 5 to 10 year forecasting as well. Our next big opportunity working with you will be July 5th. That is the Wednesday work session, and that will be on water and sewer rates. And we'll look to just update you on where we are at that plan. We're working with Raftellus again, also looking at the surcharge rate that we charge to our large sewer customers, and then hoping to do some overview with our utility billing as well. The next opportunity is, and this is following a pattern that we started last year, we'll be submitting the budget to you in the middle of July, and look to have a general work session on the budget at the July 18th work session. I'm going to skip over the bounce and balance for right now and just hit some of the other things. These other dates follow similar to what we've done in prior years. Have a work session on the capital budget at the August 15th work session, and then have a special work session on the operating budget with the hopes of submitting the budget for adoption either on September 5th or 19th. Along with the property tax rates, which have been moved back, and I think this is the 3rd year that we're in a September spot for approving the property tax rates. But I'm going to hand it over to Kim because one of the things that we're excited about is a new session.
So we are attempting to put the fun in fund balance with a new event called Bounce and Balance. So yeah, I know, get ready for accounting jokes. Really, this kind of kicked off last year with more of a resident focus, an opportunity for residents to kind of look at the prepared budget, ask some questions, and kind of make department directors more available for individual resident questions. As you know, not everybody's excited or even wants to come to a public meeting, but they might have questions about the budget. We'd like to kind of make ourselves available and maybe even have some fun doing it. So this will be an event. It'll be August 1st, Tuesday. It will actually replace your normal work session. That way we're not adding to the calendar of city council meetings. But we'll be at the Parks and Recreation Center. We will have a bounce house, and we'll talk about how we are balancing the budget. So we're hoping to make this more of an engaging and kind of a fun, as much fun as you can get with a public budget event, to kind of allowing maybe some more families to come out. And while their kiddos are playing, maybe answer some questions that they might have about public budgeting process. So we're looking forward to it. We thought we would try something new, maybe get a few more people out to be able to ask their questions and just kind of have some fun with the budget. One more thing, right before I hand it over to Nick. Throughout this area, one of the things that you have talked about during the strategic planning process is the expiration of a use tax. We understand that that might be kind of a fragmented, it's newer to the community. You may not understand the fiscal impact of having a use tax would be. So we will be presenting what the city's forecasting looks with or without a use tax. So just, I thought that I'd put that out there. We talked about it last time during the strategic planning session, is that the use tax is actually just a modernization of tax code. It just applies the city's local tax rate to online purchases. So that's all that would be. As people, as consumers change their spending habits, the city's local taxes are not being applied, and that is factored into some of our forecasting if we continued without that particular tool in the toolkit. So I'm going to hand it on over to Nick, and he's going to begin walking us through.
Okay, I'm going to start with the general fund, which is the city's largest individual fund. Just to kind of recap some education purposes, this houses our public safety, admin, buildings and grounds, and community development operating departments. It is very heavily wage-driven, or personnel-driven. So 80% of the general fund is wages and benefits. That's a little bit higher than maybe we might see in some other communities, but we also, a lot of our capital that might have been paid out of the general fund, we have a gaming fund that pays for a lot of that ongoing capital. So as Kim mentioned earlier, a key component of this budget cycle is going to be a 5-year personnel forecast. So really looking, especially in those public safety departments where we've seen increased calls for services, and looking at different space needs over the next several years, what will be the personnel required to keep up with current services and even look towards enhancing that as well. So when we're looking at cost drivers, wages are just going to be the number one just by the fact that it's 80% of the general fund, but also looking at things like our liability insurance premiums that have continued to increase year over year, double-digit growth, at least the last couple of years. That's something that we continue to look at and continues to put pressure on the general fund. From a revenue standpoint, the biggest growth driver has been sales tax over the last couple of years. We've seen double-digit growth, and actually through the first 5 months of 2023, we've seen that continue. Some of that is inflation, a rebound from the early stages of the pandemic. When we look out to the future past the next couple years, we are very conservative on our revenue estimates. So you can see the overall downward trend. A lot of that is us being conservative. So we're projecting 1-2% growth on our revenue side, 3 to 5% growth on the expenditure side. So that's where you see a lot of that gap. So when I'm looking at sales tax and projecting that out, we look pretty good for this year, but it's hard for me to continue that that growth outlook. It's harder on the revenue side to project that out. Also on the revenue side, property tax has been growing, fairly steadily, and a lot of that has been due to the surtax, which is not under the same constraints. However, there has been a drop-off in the surtax with the vote of Proposition A from November, so we have factored that in. It's about, we're calculating about a $35,000 loss on the surtax, but that has been one of our biggest growth drivers in the past couple of years as well. So that, why you're seeing an overall negative trend in the general fund, a lot of it's conservative revenue estimates, along with we have a better understanding of what our expenditure growth is going to be over the next couple of years. So, again, one of the biggest drivers in the general fund is our sales tax. We put in what would this look like with the use tax, and while you can see the overall trend starting to look very similar, if you look all the way over to the right, you can see instead of dropping down to, and I'll go back, 100% deficit, with the use tax, it drops us down just over the next 10 years. If everything stayed the same and this all went as we forecasted it, down to just a 0%. So the use tax, and we've polled some other cities who have implemented the use tax, it's been getting about 20% of what general sales tax gets. So that is what we forecasted. In the general fund, that'd be about $1.4 million current per year. So again, still an overall negative trend with our conservative revenue estimates, but it does help, and that does help with future forecasting and expenditure needs. Okay, so the Parks Fund is next, and this is one of our special revenue funds. This does incorporate the new sales tax that was just passed. Has a current fund balance projection of 54% for the end of this fiscal year. Their cost drivers, similar to the general fund, are wages, but also incorporating capital, River Forest Park being one of the big ones there. And then as the sales tax starts to get into their coffers, what does operations and maintenance look like for the park? So it's somewhat of an incomplete one right now, because this will start to fill out as they, start receiving the funds and figure out programmatically what they're going to do. So the sales tax is going to be the biggest revenue driver there. Probably look at working with them on what the transfers from gaming look like in the future, and this helps offset the pressure that they're receiving from the property taxes, as well as what the general fund has been seeing. If we incorporate, when you look at that with the use tax, that just further, helps with their programming and operating and capital discussions. But those will be ongoing discussions. We anticipate that sales tax will probably start to come in towards the end of this year, calendar year. And we anticipate that FY 2024 is going to be more of a bridge year, where we would probably continue to transfer funds from gaming as we have been, to allow that department to program more naturally and not have to just be cut off from city funds.
Yeah, just to kind of put another point onto that. So as we are preparing the upcoming, which is fiscal 24 year, we do anticipate the budget to look very similar to what it has in the past. And again, with the goal of making sure that Parks and Recreation is sustainable moving forward, kind of a bridge year would really help them do that. And then in 2025, we would have discussions, and the budget transfer would look a lot different. In fact, we're estimating that there wouldn't be any. So just kind of 2024 would be a bridge year, 2025 would be kind of what their new fiscal capacity would allow.
So I'm actually going to jump into our utility funds right now, and starting with water. This has been an ongoing conversation with the rate study, and we are continuing to work with Raptelis to confirm the rates that we had put in in their 6-year kind of ramp up that they had put in a couple years ago. Right now, that would call for a 15% increase for water and a 7% increase for sewer. So the sewer side is actually going down. The increase is going down quite a bit from prior years, and water is actually going down too. From this year was a 20% increase. Next year, if the rate study continues to show what it is, it would be a 15%, and then following that would be, we have 4% budgeted going forward after the 2024 calendar year. The biggest factor in here is going to be what's going to go on with capital. As Kim mentioned earlier, we're doing water, wastewater, and stormwater plans right now. What are those going to render, and what does our capital outlook look like for the next 10 years as we hope to look towards implementing the recommendations from that? So that is the water fund. Wastewater or WPC fund, similar. The cost drivers there are capital, as well as a significant portion of that of the cost is the sewer charges that we pay to Kansas City, Missouri. Right now, they're looking at about 6 to 7% increases annually. For next year, we have at least projected with the current rate study would be a 7%, followed by a 4% rate increase ongoing after that. So again, the similar drivers as the water fund, and looking at what the wastewater and stormwater funds or master plans in particular come back with, that will dictate a lot of what the future needs are for this fund. Gaming fund is the next one, and no significant changes since our last forecast update. Again, as we start to work with the Parks Department, and we've also got a couple other large contracts coming up with community center and also our fiber network. What happens with those is going to dictate a lot of what happens with the transfers that come out of the gaming fund right now, which was 75% of the total expense in that fund. We're projecting that to be lower as we start to work on those key items. But capital will continue to be a cost driver there. We have the facilities master plan, which similar to the water, wastewater, and sewer plans, will dictate a lot of what our capital needs are for the next several years. The Burlington Corridor project is one that is continually ongoing. Those will be the biggest cost drivers for the gaming fund. And then overall revenue, we continue to see, after a bounce back from 2020 when the casino was closed, we've continued to see just a slight downward trend in those gaming revenues, and what is the impact on that for future years. Also, Northgate, which has been steadily contributing between like $900,000 and a little over $1 million over the last couple of years. Those revenues will start to drop off in 2027 and completely drop off in 2032. So that is factoring into our 10-year forecast for that fund. Okay, so the next one is our transportation fund, and this is probably the biggest change from our November forecast outlook. It is heavily dependent on what happens with transit services, and so what we built into this forecast was what happens if we are paying the full amount of the KCATA contract. So that's with no federal subsidies or other subsidies built into that cost. So it does look very dramatic. We start off with a projected 100% fund balance at the end of this year, but this is almost exclusively driven off of what does transit service look like going forward.
Council members.
Can we hang on to this slide for the upcoming council meeting, please?
So this right here, and I did send over the KCATA, and it's printed at the dais
Right.
for your review later on. So this is the entire, should 100% of operations transfer to enclave cities, which is North Kansas City, that would estimate to be 2.1 million annual. The fund only receives 1.8 annual. So just that is kind of why this green bar looks very sad in this particular graph. We're hoping that the negotiations would go better and that perhaps we'd only take on half, but half of 2.1 million is still about 1.1 million. And again, so there would be a lot of pressure in this particular fund. We do have humans in this particular fund: salt, snow removal, trees, pothole, street lights. All of those things are programmed in this particular fund.
Do we have, let me clarify, so this is with the full amount of the enclave city. Now, the proposal is 50%, from what I understand, that we would cost share with Kansas City. And that's what you were alluding to with the 1.1? Okay. And then the federal funds, if they show up, or state funds and whatnot, could lower that, but
It could
you can't assume it.
It could absolutely lower it. Again, though, the city, when you sign a contract, it's that top number, it's not the bottom number. So we would be obligated to that top number, and from an accounting standpoint, that's the number that you have to budget. Obviously, it would be great if we got a lot of federal funding and it helped offset those costs. However, when you're talking about responsible budgeting, you do need to pin those numbers at the top.
Yeah, and the way the KCATA contracts are written, even if we hit that top line number early, they just cancel and we figure out how much more it's going to cost. So, yeah, that's a minimum that we would pay. Okay, thank you.
So again, and Kim gave a really good update there. This is primarily a sales tax driven fund. It gets, I believe, 80% of its funding is from the transportation sales tax. We do also get some motor fuel revenue in there as well. So one of the things that, and again, when we talk about forecasting, we can budget out the expenditures and show kind of the worst case scenarios on that side, and we don't do that we don't do the best case scenarios on the revenue side. We stay very conservative with that. So one of the things that, if this starts to trend the way it's trending right now, we would have to start looking at the gaming transfer again, which right now does fund a pretty significant portion of the current KCATA costs. What would that look like going forward if it has to supplement more? Use tax does help in the transportation fund. So, you look at that negative 200 number over here, it goes to negative 60 with projected use tax. But again, it's continuing the same cost drivers and revenue considerations overall. Are there any questions on any of the individual fund forecasts? Again, we will be incorporating this more both in the narrative and in the overall budgeting for fiscal year 2024, and keeping that going forward.
So, and kind of part of the new budgeting process, and we're hoping that you guys appreciate this. We love doing these kind of things. Was that every 6 months we would like to kind of run these numbers out and make sure the governing body has a really good understanding of what the revenue is looking like and what the expense is looking like on both a short and long-term view. So that was kind of our plan from a staff perspective, is just to kind of touch base every 6 months with you. Let us know if that's not something you guys would like to continue to do. We just feel like stuff moves and grooves quite a bit over a 6-month period, and it does hit these numbers sometimes very hard.
Councilmember Smith.
Just thanks for this, Nick. This is helpful. Just a bit of feedback on when we're looking at use tax versus not use tax. If you could keep that scale on the right static, because the line looks the same graph to graph. It's hard for my brain to wrap around. But if we're looking at the 200, the minus 200, and watch the line flatten out, that would be visually more helpful.
Absolutely, I think that's a great idea.
So we thought we'd kind of touch base again just on a couple of challenges, opportunities, and thoughts moving forward. property tax pressures. There is some legislation moving through the House and Senate about what personal property tax kind of looks like. So over the last couple of years, both property and personal property tax, there's been a lot of discussion on those particular items. That seems to be a base of revenue that seems to be eroding, or the goalposts seem to be moving a bit on us. And that's why, when we're looking at our long-term projections, the Blankenship decision definitely hit both the Library and Parks Board pretty hard. The surtax has hit all 4 funds, including the pension fund, of which we didn't cover this evening. That vote did hit 4 individual funds. The pension is another thing that the city council had passed an ordinance that should that particular fund not perform correctly, it would be subsidized by the general fund. So that's kind of a double effect on that particular fund.
What
So-
was the Blankenship? You kind
the-
of glazed past that.
Sure, the Blankenship decision was a court decision, actually came out of a St. Louis County, and it was how Parks and Library Board's funding, so there was a calculation which allowed them to go above and over the assessment rate, the legal ceiling on that, in particular counties under particular circumstances, and there was a court ruling that struck that down. That did impact both the library and parks funding. I kind of went back when that decision was made, and I visited with both boards to let them know what the fiscal impact would be for that particular one. Thankfully, it was not a going back decision, it was a moving forward decision. So we didn't have to kind of go backwards and refund it. That was a moving forward clause, but that did impact, I want to say it was like 11% on one of them. I can't remember. I do have the memo. I'm happy to send that to the governing body that actually calculated out what that meant to them. And then, of course, the surtax. So between those 2 different decisions, which kind of happened over a 3-year calendar period, it did impact libraries and our library board and our parks board. It didn't impact the general fund or anything that you see this evening.
Yeah, so you mentioned property tax pressures and personal in particular, because I know real estate values have gone through the roof. I know a number of us have gotten our assessments recently, and they're not fun. But the personal side, I've been doing some research, and like Missouri is one of the highest personal property tax states. I didn't realize there was pressure to remove that or slide it back. How much of our funding base is coming from that, and do we know what is being targeted as far as the goal of, is it go to 0? Is it just slash automobile?
It's not go to 0. It is on how that value is set. It's actually the assessment component of the bandwidth of how property is taxed. Personal property is taxed. It actually is creating some very specific guidance on how personal property is assessed.
There are generally bills filed that go anywhere from 0 on all property tax to some formula in the middle, and I would venture to guess there's no less than 50 probably filed this session, if not more. I mean, it's always a frequent target out there is any sort of a taxation.
Yeah.
And so whether that be a cap on sales tax, a cap on property tax, or just saying you can no longer collect this, all variations are kind of out there.
And what is the percent, like personal property? Do we know how much personal property tax makes up our revenue as a city?
We do, and I can send a more detailed breakdown. It is, I want to say it was close to 500,000 in the general fund. We do break out that number and have that
That'd be
breakdown.
helpful.
So I can send that so I can get you actual 100% factual information there.
Sure.
which is my-
Next time I start griping about vehicle taxes, I'd like to know how much that's hitting the city's bottom line. Thanks.
Another challenge would be the volatility of sales tax. So when you look at revenue projections, generally speaking, property stays consistent. It's a nice consistent bar. Sales tax fluctuates heavily with markets. It has raged in the past, and then it has recessed in the past. And I hate to use the R word, although I did just use it. There's been this looming threat of the big R coming. We are starting to see some indicators, especially with a few bank failures, that could be more real than it has in the past. But it is something that we are very mindful of. It is why we're very conservative on when we're looking at our revenue threads, is sales tax can wax and wane overnight. So that's something that when we are looking forward to a lot of these projections, property tax is very standard, but our sales tax, we are very, very conservative when we are projecting those numbers out, because it really goes off of disposable income and spending habits. So that is something that can be dropped in the overnight. Increase operating costs, that you've bought things at the grocery store just like the rest of us. Labor is going up, cost of items is going up. That's some of the things that as we are going through our budget, the cost of capital outlay, some of the assets that we have projected to purchase next year have doubled in price overnight. So that is some of the things that we are starting to see that are kind of giving us a little bit of pause. We are kind of running the numbers to make sure that we are able to do that. Some of these are capital assets we cannot do business without. I mean, I'm talking about an ambulance, I'm talking about a fire truck, I'm talking about a police vehicle. We really don't have the ability to not move forward with some of these capital assets that have gone up 30, 40, 50% in one calendar year. So those are just some of the things that are on our radars. Increased calls for service, we have mentioned this before. We are blessed to be a growing community. But that does not come without pain. We will probably be talking about adding some positions this coming proposed budget year that kind of addresses some of the pain points we are having with our calls for service. There's that R word there about a possible recession. And again, we do have some aging infrastructure. In fact, on tonight's agenda, you saw that we have we have an aging storm system, and they're very large, and when they break at a very large dollar amount. So those are some of the things that we are kind of keeping on our radar. Some of the opportunities, we have talked tonight about what a use tax would do. Again, those would hit just the general revenue. That would hit our parks, our public safety sales tax. It would hit the transportation fund, and it would also hit the park sales tax. So that would be kind of an opportunity. Again, it is just a modernization of the tax code and applying what that purchase price would have been if you had bought that in a brick and mortar store here in town. The marijuana tax is something that has been discussed before. That's another area of opportunity. Increased business and visitor activity. That's some of the things that we are looking at. How do we support our business community? How do we get more people to patron and support our businesses? When those businesses thrive, so does the community. Exploration of additional revenue sources. We have been fortunate to be able to obtain some grants. We are trying to find and pair grant opportunities with projects that are already in motion or that is going through the strategic planning process. Again, some of the things that have to be considered with that is when you obtain grant funding, oftentimes it slows a project down. These are the things that you have to mindfully be aware of and just factor into your decision tree. We do have some pretty large-scale capital projects that we are looking at grant funding on. Understanding that with that comes additional work. In fact, Nick, Anthony, and I are going tomorrow to learn all of the fun new requirements with our ARPA funding grant that the city has received. So we're helping that on the May 20th City Council and Parks and Recreation Board meeting, that we'll have a better understanding of what receiving that grant funding will do to the timeline of the project. And we are also looking at exploring revenue recovery options. We've kind of talked before about is our permitting process recovering, or what rate of recovery is acceptable to the governing body, and there's a balance there. Oftentimes, a lot of what we do is service. That's the name of the game. We are a public service. But how much of those services would the governing body like us to recover the cost of doing? Future considerations, as Nick had mentioned, we do plan to do our next water rate study, or at least conversation about what that looks like on July 5th. Facilities and audit capital outlay, that's something that we are hoping to do, to take a look at all of these buildings, what needs to be done to these buildings so that we can put that into that 10-year capital plan. Kind of some of the things that Nick and I are working on is over the next couple of years, what we'd really like to do is get a really comprehensive view of all things maintenance that are required to keep what we have going within this city. And that includes public facilities, that includes public infrastructure, as well as the personnel needed. That way, we have a really good comprehensive look to make those investment decisions together. Upcoming renewal of operations and services agreements. There are a couple of contracts, namely the YMCA and the Link City contract that are coming up for negotiations. Those would be something that we look forward to working with the governing body as we move forward on what those contracts look like as part of renewal. Bond versus pay-as-you-go, that's stuff that we are kind of looking at. I think when we look together at the results of the stormwater, wastewater, and water infrastructure, there will be some decision trees of do we look at that as a comprehensive capital outlay project and bond it and pay for it over a 20-year period and pay the cheaper cost. It's never going to be cheaper than now to do those style of
Councilmember
investments.
So the renewal service and operation, just looking forward to those with the YMCA and Link City, what's that going to look like? Is that going to be staff and the YMCA staff and exec people get together and negotiate and then bring a contract to the governing body, or is it going to be bring them to the podium and we hash it all out here? What is that going to look like?
We envision that being conversations with the governing body so that you can provide us direction on what that would look like moving forward. Would it be an open process? Will we negotiate with our current partners? There's a lot of considerations, and we figure we would like to kind of earmark some time to have some thoughtful discussions with the governing body on what that process should look like.
Because those are coming up.
They sure are.
Within, the next 12 months, both of them?
We have some decisions to make this calendar year
Yeesh.
on what that looks like.
Okay.
Yes, we do.
Because the earlier we kickstart those discussions, the better.
We are hoping to have that done in the coming summer months to kind of get some direction from the governing body, because there are some notification deadlines in both of those contracts.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Adaptive reuse with current infrastructure capacity. So these are kind of all the things that we are looking at. The next conversation with the governing body will be, again, looking at that economic development policy. What should that look like to make sure that it is meeting the needs of this community? And then just the fact that we are growing. Like I said, we're anticipating over the next couple of years, at least 2,000, upwards of 2,000 new residents calling North Kansas City home. And with those new residents come, an expectation of services, and what does that look like? So that is, do you guys have any questions about anything that we have kind of gone over on future considerations? I know it's riveting.
Some of the next steps that we'll be looking at, incorporating into the 2024 budget, are starting to codify our fund balance policy, which you saw that as on each of the individual funds, kind of our goal for each one of those, generally 50%. But we want to actually codify that and put together plans for when and if we start to dip down and get closer to those numbers, what is our strategy for going back up. So we'll be looking at incorporating that policy into the 2024 budget along with our capital policy, which would explore a lot of the bond versus pay-as-you-go. What are the decision points on those types of things? So those help us from an annual budget perspective, from ongoing conversation, put together the best decision packages possible. And then as well, looking at revenue options, and how do we incorporate all of this into our budget and strategic plan.
So with that, is there any questions that
Very
we
good.
can answer?
Any questions? Councilmember Tuttle.
I have a question that would be for the future to discuss, because I know that as far as additional calls for police and fire, our daytime population is much, much larger than our nighttime population. So I wasn't sure if the incoming residents were a cause of the calls or if daytime influx. I didn't know if there was a pattern to increase calls evenings, daytime, if it had to do with increasing our apartments or if it had to do with new businesses. I just kind of to feel that out.
We would probably schedule a conversation at a future council. There has been some data analysis of when we are receiving these calls. I don't know if it can be a causation, but EMS, calls for EMS services is definitely one of the drivers. Calls for medical is absolutely one of the increases of call volumes that we are seeing.
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Seeing no other, is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn?
Second?
All in favor, please say yes.
Yes.
Opposed, no. We are adjourned.